Do you think human rights are innate within us, or is that simply a product of, let's say, religious teaching or modern moral relativism?
Human rights isn't necessarily intrinsic, and that is to say that it wasn't sitting there and we just found it one day, right? Like it didn't already exist, in my humble opinion. Human rights is more something that, over the course of many years of exposure to the social settings that we're now going to find ourselves for the majority of our lives, we found kind of this answer so that way, everyone's at least in a better place for themselves and in regards to their community. And in a way, I guess it's kind of like it's a way for better survival for humanity. It's a way of protecting ourselves, human rights. So I definitely don't think it's intrinsic, but I think there might be a point where humanity hit something and then we started unraveling what we think would be best to help, ourselves protect each other and survive. That's my take on it.
I would like to think that's the case too. But at the same time, it makes me wonder, how do you enforce this? You can think about the UN's human rights treaties. I think there are 9 of them for the member nations. And it's fascinating to me that the bar isn't the same across the human species. It's not that every law has evolved in the same way because we have this innate sense of goodness. Let's look at a really basic example. You could look at women's rights in different countries, or you could look at labor laws, things like that. It's different depending on where you live. But on the flip side, I find it hard to believe that there's no innate moral sense on a very basic level, that if we see someone suffering, biologically there's no reaction there. So it's really fascinating to me that I'm sure it's a mix of both. To where that mix lands, I don't know. But if that's the case, without a full understanding of human psychology, which that won't happen for quite a long time, I don't know how we can actually enforce this. Locally, for example, is difficult, but globally especially, given that the political world, the geopolitics of the world, every region, doesn't necessarily operate under the same set of laws, the same Bill of Rights as Americans assume everyone deserves.
Yeah, that's interesting, particularly the question about enforcing it. So I just pulled up the Human Rights Declaration that the United Nations brought forth, that you mentioned, actually. And it's quite interesting taking a look at some of these, because there's definitely some countries that come to mind that quite clearly and consistently go against what many of these articles are trying to afford to people. And so enforcing it's kind of, that's an interesting question. I've never really thought about, on the scale of like humanity, creating an underlying human rights code. Or maybe I've thought about it, but I've never really thought about it practically. And so, because it'd be hard to do it without conflict, especially. And I'm not particularly well read in current events with foreign nations, but I am well aware that some of the things that countries like China, some countries, or rather some districts or some parts of African countries, and even some parts of Mexico, with like the cartel that pretty much in some places run the population, that people are okay with these kind of their own sets of rules. And when you look at these different places, there's mismatches with at least what you see in the United Nations and here in the U.S. So I feel like when I think back to my answer about survival, some part of me thinks that might be relative, especially with how intricate the human mind is, and subsequently how much you can manipulate it. I don't know about the Chinese population and their general feelings about their government. They might tell you all day that they love it, but who knows if that's the truth or not. I don't sit down with the Chinese family every night and talk to them about, under the rug if they like their government. But like with Nazi Germany, there were a healthy number of people that were okay with slaughtering millions of people. And this isn't to say that they were innately bad, but in their circumstance, they were maybe some eager, some not, but they were ready to eliminate a healthy portion of people who've done nothing wrong. So it's quite interesting. I don't want to think it's relative, and that's merely because I think with incongruencies, you'll run into a lot of problems and disagreements that might lead to further conflict on something like human rights.
Well, let's look at Nazi Germany, because although I'm not a historian, I don't know a ton about European history, it would be interesting to see if there was a way to know this, how many proclaimed Nazis actually supported the eradication of Jews, or more expansively, homosexuals and Catholics, and you can go on from there. Because part of me thinks a large portion of the population must have supported this. Obviously, they condoned it, at least implicitly. But at the same time, it could have been a very small, powerful minority that had convinced the rest of the population, or at least those who weren't Jewish, that this is what you need to do to be part of the winning side of history, or to not be hunted down by your government. Something of a fear response. And in that case, it would be interesting to note if it were the case that actually only a very small percentage of Nazis really deep down wanted to murder another race of people, so to speak, or if that was purely socially constructed and intrinsically there wasn't this pushback. Now, I'm going to assume this is not a common perspective among historians of European history, but it could be. I don't know. But it does make you wonder about human innate goodness, and I'm sure there's so many cases like this. You could look at Spanish Inquisition. You could look at slavery. Did all slave owners feel nothing towards their slaves, or was it that the economic gain was worth the moral, conscious, cognitive dissonance? If you follow what I'm saying.
It's quite interesting the way you brought up like a loud minority when referencing Nazi Germany as a potential, explanation for how people got into that mindset. And when we talk about that, it kind of makes me relate, at least in my mind, just looking at these articles, these human rights articles from the United Nations, almost similar to like Newton's laws of motion, And I see it that way because if we were to look at Nazi Germany in the sense of, okay, it was a loud minority of people that were able to manipulate others, well, we could look at this a universal human rights is a protection against those kinds of groups of people who, out of fear or something more malicious, decide to create a movement that's much greater than it should be. And so, that was just an interesting thought that I thought I should share, and it kind of makes these things seem more intrinsic than I originally thought they were. But it's interesting when we look at motivations and reasons why people would do things, and I feel like motivations always mess up when we're trying to come to an answer, but if something was morally correct. Because oftentimes you look at something called malicious intent, And how do you determine that? And, in the court of law, when someone murders someone, it's pretty cut and dry. But when you look at like groups of people and movements of people, it becomes much harder to nail down, the pure intent, especially when we're discussing human rights. And it's quite interesting because at my work, I'm not going to throw any names out, of course, but there's some people who don't like a manager at my work. And that's just because he uses certain language, and he's from a foreign country. And I think the way he was raised there, and the social structure of not only the family unit but his coworkers and how you treat friends was entirely different, or maybe not entirely, but at least somewhat different where he was from. And so whenever he says these things, people get upset, but I don't think he does it out of malicious intent. And so this is a small kind of side tangent, but I thought it was interesting to help explore more this idea of intent. Like when you brought up economic gain versus actually just wanting to treat people horribly. Does that excuse anything? That's another debate. I'll tell you one thing. I don't think it's necessarily excusable, being a mass slave owner, but I think it gives better insight into maybe how we should treat each other. Because I think that's kind of also what human rights obviously tries to answer. How should we treat each other?
Well, let's expand that to today's economic world. Look at global capitalism. We're in a unique place where you can have sweatshop labor for Nike overseas, or children working in certain African cobalt mines, which are a vital facet to our technology supply chains. But there isn't any enforcement in America because obviously these companies, while stationed in America, I don't know the legality of it, but are certainly able to do these things on foreign soil because that is those soils' laws. They're different. And that's one great example where intent is questioned, because it might be the case that Apple and Tesla and Nike, they don't have any malintent towards other countries. Maybe these shops actually, while from an American perspective are terrible wage, but for them may actually be more money than they could have made otherwise. We just are imposing our perspective on that. That could be the case. But then it's interesting, is there any kind of moral duty for businesses, ethical business? That's a really popular phrase now, at least in the West. Look at a company like Whole Foods, prides itself on ethical business. Granted, it's been bought by Amazon, so there's something of a conflict of interest there in many people's eyes. But what value do you think intent plays in the business world? Does it matter if businesses intend to have child labors or not, but because it's part of the supply chain, they just let it happen because it makes them money? Or is there a deeper issue of even allowing accidental, presumably problematic issues to arise?
So, great question, because very touchy, but very real. So one of the things that I think businesses need to be held accountable for this, but the problem is, like you mentioned, they're outsourced. And so when you bring up this problem, you pretty much have to bring it up with the country in question too. You got to say, look, this company's working here, but you're allowing this labor. You need to enforce it. And so we're kind of outsourcing that law enforcement to other countries, which makes perfect sense. They're sovereign. So for the U.S. to throw military or police in there would throw into question their sovereignty, which is definitely something that would be, very, very controversial, especially as a citizen of that country, if you have any pride in it or if there's any sense of nationalism in it. At which point, I guess the question becomes, do people value their pride or their nationality more than they do ethical business practices, or do they even have the time in their life to care about that? I don't know. Or if they even see it as wrong. I don't know many people that see as child labor as a okay thing to do. So I'm going to assume that that's almost entirely ruled out. But I do think they should be held accountable, though. Despite their interest being in a profit, I'm glad you brought this up because it almost sounded like, to me, all that mattered was intent. So therefore, by my logic, these companies should be able to get away with all this, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. Because I don't think a profit is necessarily well-intentioned half the time, especially if you throw out or you disregard the well-being of others for that profit. I definitely think they need to step in a right direction. Do I know how we would enforce it? I don't know. We'd have to work with the foreign countries. But I imagine if it's still happening, they got other things on their docket they want to look at, or, people who are in that trade of child labor or maybe even slavery work in the government. So I wouldn't know. There might be a lot of corruption behind all of that that's preventing anything ethical from getting achieved.
It's really challenging to unpack because as much as I like capitalism in theory, and I really do, this is a great example of the potential flaws, at least in a global market, because different countries have different rules, different standards. You can extrapolate this to a parallel case of individual human rights that aren't necessarily economically driven, but look at China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslims. And no one's really been talking about that. Granted, at the G7 summit, it looks like that's finally being discussed, as well as other things to do with China, which I'm not an expert on international relations by any means. But it is fascinating because this pure market can be so efficient, but then if you can abuse an entire country's labor, how is that acceptable? Frankly, it brings forth an interesting concept that could, let's say America, because that's where we are, could America not allow its companies that are founded here to outsource labor to other countries under certain practices? I don't know if that would be efficient, doubtly so. I know in my intro to business courses I took, it's not a question of whether or not it's ethical. It's a question of whether or not it's cheaper to outsource. That's it. It's just purely economic. But if there's no underlying unifying standard, I don't actually know how you can have a perfect solution to solve the world's human rights issues. And frankly, everyone's perspective of what human rights are is different. And that leads into the religious point for a lot of people, whether fundamentalist Christian or in an Islamic state or something like that. Your rights are going to be different. Maybe women don't drive in your country. Does the UN need to now enforce some kind of laws to allow them to drive to work in the mornings? Well, that's a really fascinating piece of the economic sphere. 50% of the population are women. And this is just one example. So to pin down a question for you, what role do you think religion has in this? And do you think that there's any kind of moral standard that A, is taken from religion, which I would argue is obvious, but I'm curious what you think. And then secondly, should we use these value systems as a way to enforce our secular values, our secular business practices, and so forth? Interesting.
So I can tell you right now that a lot of the morals and values that I kind of foster in my life and that I try to practice came from my parents, and mostly parents, I would say, is a healthy guess. I wouldn't actually know. I don't sit here and think about what I learned from who. But they attributed a lot of what they got to religion. As I got older, I made a disconnect because my brain just wasn't able to believe in that, and that's my own thing to worry about. But I think there are some I don't know if I want to call them fundamentals because I'm not well read on these religious works, but some things that have been taught to me from religion, I think, are things that are generally in line with what you would see in Western human rights activism. So respecting people, giving them their personal space, letting them be their unique person, and not degrading them or trying to hurt them. And so, I mean, for me, right, with my moral compass, it comes down to one term. This term might be different for different people, or it might not even be something that certain people care about in their moral compass, but it's respecting others. That is like basically the one thing that it comes down to in my mind. If I can learn to respect someone, I will open up to their ideas. Doesn't necessarily mean I'll agree with them, but when I'm open to that, that throws away any risk of harm, because the only reason why you would harm someone, I don't think we're in a really kill for survival era of humanity right now, almost unanimously across the globe, but it would usually be out of fear or misunderstanding or hatred driven by misunderstanding or fear. And so, at least that's what it comes down to in my mind. How would we convey that to others? I'm not sure, because that might mean different things. And do some people even care about that? I'm not sure. Would you say that respect is kind of something that's generally cared about across the globe?
In some ways, I think it is, but respect intrinsically, I don't think is the word I would use, because I'm a believer that respect is often earned, but a better term, or a term I might prefer, is something like kindness, or innate goodness, or assuming the best, something like that. Coming in, treating others the way you want to be treated, something of that gold standard you hear about. I could see that being a relatively universal experience.
Right, and I would agree with that. And so then the where the difference comes down is how we apply that, or what that means. At least that's where my mind's going, right? So like hypothetically, as some person in some other country, they might see walking on here, let me try and think of an example. I mean, I'll use a more real world example, women driving, right? Not allowing a woman to drive if you were in, I'm not sure which exact countries, but if you were not to allow a woman to drive, that might be showing her respect, preventing her from doing that, because that might be against the law, right? So I'm not exactly sure. That's where it gets a little shady and gray, is what does that exactly mean? Because I think we have a solid foundation of what that means, and we can kind of quantify it with experience, but I think there would be disagreements when you go across the seas, or even, in other states, in the United States. So I'm not sure, because I could sit here and preach about my ideals all day, but I don't think, I think they might even be taken in, but they might be interpreted differently.
It does make you wonder, to this religious point further, how some of these values evolve. Because there's many people, let's take a famous online presence example, Ben Shapiro, say Judeo-Christian values at the backbone of American democracy, or something to that extent. And that's always interesting to me. I find it to be something of a chicken and egg situation. Which came first, the progression of Christian values or the progression of American values? Many people, again, would say this backbone in Christian values led to where we are today. But at the same time, if that's the case, then why is it that our secular societies today are managing to push Christian beliefs less and less fundamental, for example? So I think in America, it seems like, well, it can't be solely rooted in Christianity. Then at the same time, however, you have states, particularly when they're religious states rather than democracies, and I'm sure that plays a role, but you have states where actually as time progresses, they don't seem to get all that much more, quote unquote, progressive. And some people would say certain Islamic states are like that because it's a more recently formed religion, and that's an argument you could make. But I also want to posit the question that maybe it doesn't just progress. Maybe we have to have that religious undertone, and maybe some are better than others, whether or not they're more true than others.
In a sense, that's kind of what the UN tried to do with these human rights thing. They kind of tried to make a new Bible. I'm not going to call it, I think that's maybe a stretch, but that's effectively what it's trying to do, because it's trying to, maybe that was a little too much, because I think the Bible tried to explain more than just how you should treat others, perhaps. Or maybe even any other of the works of religion that are out there, no matter the religion. Or maybe not. I'm trying to think about it. I mean, the only work that I'm kind of read in, and it's very short, is the Tao Te Ching for Taoism. So, and that is basically a way of life of how you treat the world, or how you perhaps should perceive it. So maybe that's a better way of stating what these religious works are trying to do. It's quite interesting, the debate about religion. Now, the more I think about it, the more cobwebs that kind of constrict whatever point I was trying to get at. But do I think it's necessary as a groundwork? That's an interesting question. It's definitely served as some sort of groundwork. I think, like you said, we're trying to get away from calling it any form of groundwork for our modern beliefs, but I think it did serve as something, at least. I'm not sure how else my parents would have attributed those beliefs they had. I mean, for me, if I were to have kids, I would have called that just innate. So it's kind of funny, because I've come back to me thinking it wasn't innate, but now I'm kind of calling it, these human rights that we're talking about. Not innate. At least that's what I originally said, something that we just kind of find as we keep going. Kind of mentioned it could be a little bit of both. I'm thinking it's leaning towards that now. Because I don't attribute it. It's kind of weird. I'm trying to think about my own psychology here as we talk about this, because I go through these interactions with people I have, and I'm trying to think, why do I think that? And it's a shitty answer, but the answer is that because I just do, And so I'm trying to unpack that a little more.
It's interesting because we're having this conversation from the lens of Americans who, as Americans know, in our Bill of Rights, we value freedom of religion. And that's been an undertone, obviously, from our Puritan upbringing. So it's fascinating that this conversation doesn't have to have that necessary requisite that we have to have some kind of religious acceptance. This innate presupposition that this is something we can't talk about because I'm just going to assume it's good and it doesn't affect our daily life, and it's held to a moral superiority regardless of the belief system, generally speaking. And it's interesting to think about how this conversation can be had without that presupposition, without a First Amendment with a subset of freedom of religion, because then this conversation might go very differently. Right now, we assume, certain religious beliefs could have led to my values today, and that's very possible. But it doesn't imply necessarily that they couldn't have without the religion. And that's the point we haven't had enough time to experiment with in human history, given that, not that science has taken anything from religion per se, but it has filled many of the problems with, God of the gaps, what was originally solving. And I think it's just an experiment throughout history to see how can humans as we become less and less religious, because that's what the trends seem to show, at least in the Western world. What will that look like? Will our moral foundations plummet? And some people argue they already are. Or will they in fact continue to progress and we realize as a collective this is the best path forward? Or maybe neither. Maybe somewhere in between. I don't know, but I'm a firm believer that history is the best experiment, and we are still a very young, progressing species. And even the term progressing from our lens only applies to some portion of the world, if you follow what I'm saying.
Yeah, and we've, at least in the United States, I mean, globally, we've only been through a period of real science for the last few hundred years, which is a smidgen of time compared to the vastness that religion was predominantly what controlled people's thoughts, or at least their perceptions. So I think you're definitely correct in that what we're going through right now is really the first of its kind, an era where if the trends continue, we're going to have a majority of people founding their beliefs on something that isn't just, a religious work. At least here in the United States. I don't know about the entirety of the West, but so at the end of the day, I'm starting to believe that that we do need to come up with some sort of universal definition of human rights. And that's because I don't know many people who look at Nazi Germany and think that was okay. If you paint it in probably the most factual light, I would say. And so when you have kind of similar stuff happening in China, I mean, I didn't know this. I'm glad you brought up the, I forgot what the summit was called, but that they're finally talking about the Uyghur Muslims and their treatment from China, because that's it's really inhumane what they're doing. It's definitely violations. I don't know exactly what it's like, but I'd imagine on similar, maybe slightly less extent to Nazi Germany's treatment of Jewish people. So, the only way you can look at things like that in a positive light, honestly, is if you were to paint the people that you're treating as not people. At least that's my understanding of it. If you treat those people as lesser beings, whatever that might be for you, right? Like, calling someone a dog, that removes any... how do I want to say this? It basically removes any reason for you to give them the benefit of the doubt or give them the treatment of being a human or being an equal. And so, I mean, I feel like it's just a perspective. I'm kind of going back and forth on my opinion here about it being something that is innate in all of us, as opposed to something that we find. But I think as information travels better and we become more transparent with what we tell each other and what's happening in the world, I think we start finding this line that we want to tread where we're going to treat each other the same, because we found that's what mostly feels good for people.
I like your point about dehumanization, in the sense that without an underlying basis for human rights, you have in fact dehumanized them. And on the flip side, these human rights can humanize people, put us all on an equal playing field, right? But I wonder what you think, and I'm sure there's going to be some bias here as an American, what you think that most important human right or human liberty is. Is there one above all else that you think is vital to the expression of humans as conscious, emotional, moral creatures? Or do you think it has to be more expansive than that? We can't just narrow it down to one, because there are so many things that are all of equal importance.
I'm gonna sound like a hippie here, maybe, but the one thing that I think is probably the most important And you can change the wording, at least in my mind. Love is a strong word. I don't use it very often, except for people I very much care for. But the saying is to not only love yourself, but love each other. I feel like if you have that appreciation and that kinship with other humans, it's very hard to misstep in many places.
What do you think is the human right that, above all else, would allow for love? Because some people would say free speech is the human right that allows the rest of them. Some people might say freedom of religion is the most important because it's going to heaven.
Probably, interesting. Probably free speech. I would say free speech. If you can speak your mind, you can make it clear what's happening without being shut down, then that's the gateway to understanding. So, and I think that's where you'll find the most appreciation.
Well, I agree. I can't imagine that's a surprise, given we have a podcast talking about free speech. But, again, acknowledging we're also Americans, and this term free speech is used not exactly the same way globally. I understand that. But, of course, I agree. And I'm sure we've said this in almost every episode, that without conversation, you have no way to hear new ideas. And without new ideas, you can't change the status quo or even challenge it. And if you can't challenge the status quo, and the status quo is a dictatorship, or even a failing of the majority in a democratic state, even the best case scenario status quo, if you can't challenge that, eventually new and better and more exciting and more interesting and more moral ideas can never, or at least will not likely ever, present themselves. Because all we know is what we've been taught, combined with a dash of free will, if you'd like. But if we're all taught the same thing and we can't ask questions and we can't challenge things, what else are you ever going to learn?
Exactly. The most important thing, and I think I said this in a previous episode, I think I'm actually a believer in that humanity should be living in this kind of weird middle area where there's unhappiness and there's happiness. And that's because knowing what's good, and I'm throwing very blanket broad terms here, but knowing what's good and knowing what's bad allows you to challenge both, and bring them into question for better refinement. And that can only be done through word of mouth or written language. And we have both of those things, which is fantastic. And in some places, like the United States, we have the freedom to use that to our advantage. So I definitely think that you should feel comfortable expressing how you feel about things, no matter what. Even if I disagree with it, or Colton disagrees with it, or we talked about it on an episode, we're like, that doesn't make sense. You know, part of the wonder of modern society is that we can talk about it. And so that is definitely, at least in our eyes, the most important gateway into reaching some sort of unanimous human rights, free speech.
Absolutely. And I won't drum on about this because we've done at least one episode dedicated to solely this topic. So I won't repeat everything we've said. But I agree. It's the backbone of progressivism, you could say, with all political connotations aside. And to humanize individuals, like you said, I also agree we need to have some kind of basis for a shared understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be legitimized as a conscious, feeling, emotional, pain-filled, joy-filled species. And I don't know how to enforce that. I don't know the best options. Maybe the UN is the best option and we get more countries to join and we become closer and closer as countries. Maybe free trade and economic relations ends up forcing us together because of global businesses. Who knows what that'll look like? But I agree. We need to have some kind of basis. Otherwise, we're going to have conflict. And conflict obviously can be wars. And as we know, war in the modern age is increasingly dangerous because it just takes cyber attacks or drones or, God forbid, nuclear weapons, which we still have plenty of, to do serious, serious damage to our species and to our planet as a whole.
Yeah, totally. I would say let's make the fine line between us surviving and going extinct, not at the press of a button that sends nuclear weapons off. Let's start with dialogue first before we get to that, at least. And so, one of the I think one of the most important things moving forward here for like human rights discussion is, honestly, I don't think I've seen it really discussed that much, at least in and maybe that's because it's obvious, but clearly not, because so many other countries think differently. But perhaps what the most important thing is, at least in my humble opinion, I think finding one thing to start working off of is going to be maybe a gateway into building on top of that. And I like we talked about earlier, there might be agreement there in that, what I call respect. But I won't know unless I talk to many other people from around the world. So,
absolutely, and maybe it's not something as high level and optimistic as respecting everyone or something like that. Maybe it's something more fundamental, like the bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just ensuring everyone has access to housing and mosquito nets. Who knows what that baseline is, but I agree. Some kind of baseline that we can move from truly is a path forward for shared human rights.